Sometimes I think that the most important thing that I've done in my life is give people pictures of themselves. Some outsider takes pictures and that's meaningful for them. And even if I don't get a picture, it's a gift for them. I mean, sometimes you just think, I can't believe this is happening. There's those things happening in the world all the time, but you happen to be there with your camera and you're ready for it. It's wonderful. I'm Sage Sohier. I've always been kind of an observer. I've been comfortable in that role. When I got to college, I worked for the college newspaper as a photographer, and I took my first photo class as a sophomore. And that was a revelation. I had never before realized that a picture could totally stand on its own and create fictions and realities and have that kind of power on its own. When I was a senior in college, Todd Papageorge was a visiting lecturer. He was so eloquent and so encouraging, really, that I started thinking that maybe this was something I could dedicate myself to. I sort of started understanding what photography was all about and what doing a project was all about. And I ended up doing my senior art thesis on umbrellas. It was basically umbrellas with things happening around an umbrella, sort of like Friedlander's The American Monument. I just started understanding what a photo series was. But back then, I think it was just the idea that, oh, a limitation, if you limit yourself and say, this is what I'm photographing, and I'm not photographing everything else, I'm just photographing this, those limitations can really be freeing. In starting to photograph American Scene, I was going out and sort of driving around and walking around in different neighborhoods, and I started running up to people who were hanging out on their porches or outside their houses or on the street and photographing them, and then coming back and looking at that work. I was really excited by what I was getting, and so I think I started realizing, oh, things are better when there are kids around. Things are better when there's groups of people because they're less self-conscious. All those things, you start seeing them on your contact sheets and on your prints. As soon as I identified what was working, I would look for that when I went out to photograph. So I would go to neighborhoods where I knew there were groups of kids hanging out. And I would get to know certain streets where I would know repeatedly there would be kids and families hanging out. And I usually like to ask permission of parents, so I would, I would try to go up to people where there were parents nearby, and that made it easier. I think I had never really thought that I would become a portrait photographer. These are all made with a Fujica 6x9 centimeter, a medium format camera with film, and so you only get 8 shots on a roll. When I first started using this camera, it slowed me down. American Scene and Passing Time are really environmental portraits, so it's a similar attempt to integrate a strong portrait of a group of people or a single person with the environment, which is hopefully telling you something about where they live. And I also was photographing inside. I was photographing my friends inside, other people inside at the same time. And when I saw something interesting, I would run up to people and say, I'd really like to photograph you just the way you are. And of course, as soon as you say that, everything changes. But hopefully, you make it clear that, no, you can just do whatever you were doing, and you don't have to look at the camera. People would get back to, especially if there's a group of people, they would get back to doing what they were doing. And if you're patient, people kind of forget you're there, and you're able to make some pictures that are interesting. I don't think I ever became a fly on the wall, but I think that, especially with groups of people and groups of children or teenagers, they have their own interaction going on. In a way, they're acting for the camera. They know I'm there, but to a certain extent, they forget about me because they care more about each other than they do about me. But they're also aware that they're kind of playing a role for the camera, and they like that sometimes. I mean, hopefully they like it. If they don't, you leave, right? I didn't spend that long with people. I would stay for sometimes just 2 or 3 photographs. Because again, I'm only getting 8 shots on a roll. So you don't want to get to the end of the roll and have to change it, preferably. You want to just be careful about what you're photographing. It's not like a digital camera where you can just take the whole card worth, which wouldn't be a good idea anyway. Some people, when you walk by them on the street, you think, oh, wow, they have star quality. I really want, I know I can maybe get a picture of that person because there's something about them that's arresting. Or a group of kids, they're doing something that you think, oh, you know, if I can just get them to do that again, that's wonderful. I would get really excited and enthusiastic, and I think that was infectious. My enthusiasm was infectious, and they would sort of get into it with me. It was something they were doing together, but they were also doing it with me. I mean, I definitely think that the pictures are collaborative. As soon as you ask permission of someone, it's going to be a collaboration because you're not taking a candid photo anymore. They're aware of you, and there's no getting around that. In a sense, they're acting themselves. They're acting the part of themselves. And that sounds a little strange, but I do think that's what a lot of these photographs are. Now, hopefully they don't look like that. Hopefully they look like something that was really happening, and it was really happening. But they were aware that they were playing a role. So American Scene is photographs from 1979 to 1985, and it's the photographs that I edited and printed, and I made exhibition prints at the time. So I have vintage prints of most of the images that are in American Scene. Passing time, the pictures were made at the same time, but most of these, some of these I have, a few of these I have vintage prints of, but most of them were images that I either didn't print or that I work printed, but I never made exhibition prints of. I thought, nah, it doesn't quite work. But going back and looking at them freshly years later, I really liked them. You know, in some cases I thought, I can't believe I didn't print that. Partly, you know, time changes things, and things that maybe weren't so interesting 40 years ago become more interesting or sometimes less interesting. So that's part of what changes the edit. But also, you just don't have preconceptions about what you wish you had gotten at the time. You can look at things with, you know, freshly and see them just for what they are. Doing Passing Time, I went back through my archive of contact sheets and negatives and, you know, to see what I had. And in looking at the contact sheets, well, first of all, I was very grateful that I hadn't kept shooting 35 millimeter because, trying to look at 35 millimeter contact sheets is so painful. That's why I have these things. So, Optivisor, I used to use these for looking at my students' 35 millimeter contacts. It has a light in it and stuff. The other thing was just, it was interesting. A lot of time had passed, and it was interesting, and I would recall, it's funny how you kind of remember the interactions a little bit in the moments. You remember what the you know, how hot it was. You remember what was going on during that day. Even though it's 40 years later, some of that comes back to you. And it was a nice way of revisiting some of my experiences in photographing during those days. Often, especially when you're shooting film, you go back and you have an idea of what your best photograph from that day was. And you know, you just think, that was it. That's what I got. And then you develop the film and you make the contact sheet and you're disappointed. You look at that picture, which was going to be your best picture, and it doesn't work. And you're crushed. And then something else that was just a total shot that you just took and you thought, it's not going to work, but you took it anyway. That's the picture. And it's so strange. That's what I like about the surprise of photography. I think that's partly why when I went back, after I did American Scene, and then I went back and looked through my 80s work, and I found all these other images that I hadn't printed. And I think they didn't get printed at the time because I remembered what I wanted from the scene rather than, I couldn't just look at them like, what did I get? And here, you know, I was looking back 30 to 40 years later, and so I could just look at them. You know, I had no preconception of what I wish I'd gotten. And so I was looking at them with sort of fresh eyes in a way. But it was really looking for a promising scene or a person that just had this quality of like, that's really beautiful. I think I can make a picture of that person that will really be amazing. Sometimes I would stop somewhere just because the environment was really interesting. You know, when I was out photographing in Pennsylvania and out near Pittsburgh, and there were all these heaps of, you know, there were coal mines and stuff, and there were these backdrops that were interesting, or West Virginia with the mountains. And you think, oh, if I see a person out, I'm going to try to make a portrait of them with that background. So you're, in a way, you're leading with the environment. That's what makes you get out of the car and try to find someone. Well, when I'm looking at my contact sheets, there has to be a really interesting expression or gesture, but also the whole frame has to work. You know, a picture is the whole thing. It's not just this one thing that's going on in the center, or, you know, it's got to be, everything's got to be interesting. The background has to be interesting. I used to like to pack the frame with lots of people and lots going on and see, you know, how much I could incorporate in the frame without it totally falling apart. That was kind of a challenge. Especially with groups of people, you know, you're moving around and your eyes are scanning the situation and you're trying to move to get the best possible frame, depending on what they're doing. You have to be quick. You don't have, it's different from street photography because you're not trying to catch people unawares. They know you're there. But it's similar in terms of, you know, you still have to be quick, and the moment, you know, the decisive moment is important. So in American Scene, there's a couple pictures that I sort of recall that have interesting stories. One of them is the cover image, which this is the full frame image. I actually took this as part of a survey project of the Fort Point Channel and Leather District in 1980. And I was walking around down below in this post office parking lot, and I saw this head sticking out a window, and I saw the pigeon right near his head. And I thought, oh, it'd be great if I could get that. But it was like 5 or 6 stories up, and here I am with my wide angle lens. So I yelled up and I said, hello, and he, you know, do you mind if I come up and take some pictures of you, just like that? And he said, sure, come on up. And so I took a bunch of pictures of him and the band, and then I said, you know, I'd really like to try to get you leaning out the window, if you don't mind. And so he lay back. The pigeon either stayed there the whole time or came back, I'm not sure. And this was one of the few times where I actually, what I envisioned in my mind's eye from seeing him down below, this is sort of what I imagined. I mean, I didn't know also that this stuff is actually good too, but you know, usually the situation changes so much that you get something totally different. But here he was willing to reenact it in a way. The other one is this Slidell, Louisiana, that I took in 1983. I was in Louisiana and there was this bad flood in Slidell. And I tried to photograph people whose homes had been flooded. And I spent about a week doing it. And when I came back, I looked at the contact sheets and the pictures were awful. It was just depressing, people with their flooded rugs and everything was wet and they were depressed. And nothing was good, but I got one picture that I really liked, and it was this picture of the little boy running into the house and this man in a suit and rubber boots in the distance. And what had happened was I had talked to this man when he went by, and he said, has anyone seen my pet alligator? And there was something about that, the fact that he was wandering around looking for his pet alligator, that just made me think, I gotta make a picture of this. So it has nothing to do with the picture, really, but it motivated me, I guess, in some strange way. So Witness to Beauty is a project I did about my mother as she got older. And it started really when she was in her 70s and went through until she was in her 80s. And she's now going to be 98 in May. She's still going. The project went on for about 10 years. She had been a fashion model in the 40s. And she'd been photographed by Richard Avedon and Irving Penn and other well-known photographers. And I had grown up looking at these fashion pictures of her. When I started Witness to Beauty, I thought, well, it would be really interesting to photograph, you know, she's an aging beauty. And then I started introducing my sister and myself into some of the pictures. And we act as we're kind of a foil to her beauty. We're kind of more the norm, and she's still putting on her makeup and she's still presenting herself in a certain way. And so it's really about beauty and aging. It's about generational differences. She had moved into her mother's house, and so the decor was very bright colors, and it was sort of somewhere in between my grandmother's heyday in the 1920s and my mother's heyday in the 1960s. So it was sort of like a little bit antique feeling. And I really liked that as a backdrop for the photographs. And I found that the best thing was if I let my mother present herself to the camera the way she wanted to. At first I was trying to catch her off guard. It never worked. And it was much better if I let her present herself. Most of the pictures are recreations of memories from childhood or adolescence, or recreations of family snapshots from then. Almost all the pictures are taken on tripod with natural light and with a self-timer. So I would go turn on the self-timer and run into the picture. So they were totally collaborative in the sense that we would have to agree beforehand who was going to look at whom. We had to hold still for the picture. And some of them are taken with flash, but most of them we had to hold still. So we collaborated, we thought of ideas together, we collaborated on the shots. The only thing that was, I think, a little difficult for my mother was she sometimes would say, well, we're not smiling in any of these. And I'd be like, and she said, well, we laugh a lot and we smile a lot. I would have to, say to her, well, it's hard to make pictures of people smiling. It looks more like a snapshot or, like a selfie or a snapshot. If you look back, at most paintings and most photographs, through history, most of them are not people smiling. That reassured her. And she also felt like some of the pictures didn't reflect our current day relationship. And I would have to explain to her, no, it's not about that. It's about my memories from childhood and growing up with a beautiful mother. And, it's not about how well we get along today. It's not about that. I love them. I mean, they're goofy. A lot of them are really silly and goofy. Here we are, these grown-up middle-aged women with this older mother, and we're what are we doing? Well, we are recreating these things from childhood. And somehow they work in a strange way, and I don't quite know why. At a certain point, she got to be maybe 84, and she said, I'm not keen to do these anymore because I just don't feel I look good anymore. And up until then, between, putting on makeup and dressing a certain way and holding herself a certain way, she had felt like she could maintain a certain veneer of beauty and feel okay about it. And then it got to a point where she just thought, no, I really don't want to. And I totally understood that. She and my sister were really good sports about doing it, and we did laugh a lot about doing it together. It was fun. And then at a certain point it got to be less fun and we stopped.
If you'd like to see more of Sage's work, I'll have some links in the description to her books and the various projects that she discussed in this interview. I want to say a massive thank you to her as well for having me at her house in Boston for this incredibly insightful interview. Before I wrap this video up, I do also want to say thank you to the sponsor of this channel for making this production possible, which is Squarespace. Squarespace is an incredible all-in-one website building platform that you can use to build your photography portfolio online. I've been using Squarespace for so many years now, and they've made it so incredibly easy to get a website up and running with my photography. If that sounds like something you're interested in, you can hit the link in my description for a 14-day free trial of Squarespace, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Willem for 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain.